Firstly, all across Asia, we've obviously had our World Cup qualification campaigns. Now into the heat of the off season, really throughout most of the northern hemisphere is kind of coming to an end. And I figured, with very little going on by way of results and whatnot, I figured it was worth talking about one team that I think really encapsulated the region a fair amount during the qualification process in the AFC, and that is South Korea, who've had a very tumultuous time with managerial changes, personnel coming and going, and probably a fair amount of disappointing results that the local fan base aren't too best pleased with. So I've been very pleased to find, a prominent South Korean football personality, Albert Kim. How are you today, Albert?
Great, Matt. Thanks for having me on. The word prominent is very generous, but always appreciate talking about the AFC with another person from an AFC country, another powerhouse, I'd like to say. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, yeah, I do like to, whenever I have the privilege of speaking with someone like yourself, I do like to kind of go back quite a bit on what really made you a football person, because I think in our corner of the globe, there are other sports that are more prominent. There are far other, very different elements of life that people can take up. So, what made football your thing growing up?
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess you can tell by my accent that I went to school in the States. I spent half of my life actually in the United States and in South Korea, but most of my primary education school years were spent in the United States, more specifically in California. And I think growing up in California, I know a lot of people don't think that Americans are into football, but in California, you play every sport. And football is definitely at the top of the list because of just the weather in that state. And we actually have quite a bit of really good footballers coming from that state when it comes to Americans. So for me, it was easy, going to school with my friends and then doing after school activities, getting into footy and playing that for about 5 to 6 years. I started out as a winger, and then as I got a little chunkier in elementary school, moved to the middle of the pitch and also played a net for a bit. But yeah, that's how I got into the game itself. And then in terms of becoming a fan, it all started when I was 6 years old. That 2002 World Cup with South Korea making it all the way to semifinals. I remember waking up at like 3, 4 in the morning with my parents and watching some epic games, our 2-1 victory over Italy in the round of 16, albeit a bit controversial, and then the 5-3 penalty shootout went over Spain in the quarters. I think as a kid, it really is important to watch these kind of iconic moments, and that really shapes what you're interested in as an adult. And ever since then, I just love the game. And then also watching somebody like Oliver Kahn at that World Cup, even though he wasn't Korean, just watching the amazing showcase he put on really got me interested into more specifically the Bundesliga and German football, which I do some work in as well. So that's my interesting story, I hope, into how I got into the sport.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. Just out of curiosity, what part of California did you
I grew
reside?
up in Southern California in Orange County, so
Oh,
in
yeah.
a city, little suburb called Anaheim Hills. So yeah, pretty. If you think about California TV shows, pretty typical. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, Anaheim's also big for sport. You've got, the Angels,
Yeah.
the Ducks, so on and so forth. So, yeah, fair enough. Okay, so a little bit about kind of professionally working in the sport as well. I am curious because I've also noticed you actually spoke to Jurgen Klinsmann at the start of the year.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
how do you come across something like that? And I know you've also you've done some work with Al Jazeera. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I started out as a reporter after college working for some international radio broadcasters here in Seoul, mostly on the radio. After that, just naturally branched off to doing some TV work for Al Jazeera during the last World Cup in Qatar. Also did some work with FIFA Plus, appeared on their daily show as one of the South Korean superfans. And then just, as you make contacts in this world, you appear on some podcasts, you do some interviews and the like, and eventually I did get a chance to interview someone like Jurgen Klinsmann. I've also been able to, interview the likes of Sergio Costa, who's the ex-assistant coach of the national team, and then I went to Germany last year and got to interview one of the young South Korean players playing there. So it really just started with my first job out of college, and then like any other profession, I think networking is what gets you into working into football itself. And I think one of the cooler experiences I had was also, since I'm based both in Seoul and North America, a few summers ago I had the chance to work as a translator for Man City for about a day when they came, and that was really fun as well. So I like to say I've done a lot in the sport. I'm not prominent by any means, but I've dipped my toe into many different parts of the industry.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And I mean, again, I'm really glad that you are here for that reason. I mean, let's just start a little bit on the national team itself. If we kind of roll the clock back to that, I don't really know if you'd call it a failure, but certainly an Asian Cup where South Korea, I think, definitely had a lot going on at the time, right? There was a lot by way of Bento and Klinsmann's tenure kind of coming to a head around that time, and For me, I just want to know, firstly, is it the senior players in the team and their sort of departure or their priorities with clubs in Europe and the like that have really kind of got the team into this unknown kind of era that they're in now, or what exactly is the problem that kind of kicked all this off?
I think it's hard to point at one specific reason as to why the national team hasn't done well since the post Bento era.
Mm,
If you look at the manager who was hired after him, although think he's a very kind man and I have had lunch with him any time, I don't think Jurgen Klinsmann was the best choice to be the manager. But I think that was more representation of the symptomatic issues in Korean football, mainly which starts with the Football Association. I know many countries around the world hate their associations because of how corrupt they are, but I think the level of corruption and incompetence in the KFA is really another level. And the way that I explain it is that most associations, I think, have lots of business sponsors or some rich benefactor backing the company, quote unquote, itself, so they can, pay the players, pay for, travel to tournaments, whatnot. In South Korea, it's funded by basically a group called HDC Group, which is kind of related to Hyundai Cars. I'm getting a bit
yeah.
technical, but it's a big conglomerate. And in South Korea, essentially, these chaebols or conglomerates control all the national sports because they fund them. And we have a man named Chung Mong-gyu who's at the top of HDC Group, but he also is at the head of the KFA, basically a nepotism baby, a nepo baby who just kind of stumbled into the position because by virtue of being born into a certain family. And the way he runs it is almost like his own personal fiefdom, where he puts in officials who aren't qualified at certain positions. He hires coaches based on his own personal preferences, a la Jurgen Klinsmann and the current manager, Hong Myung-bo. So I think that, yes, there are issues within the national team in the locker room, which we could talk about later if you want, but I think really it's just an issue of the people who run this association. And as they say, a fish rots from the head down.
Mm. So, I mean, when it comes to just again touching on the personnel in terms of the quality that South Korea have, is there a lot of is there a concern around the current crop right now that you're going to struggle to move on from a lot of these senior guys kind of moving on? Because I mean, again, that the core that's based in Europe now, I mean, a lot of it was still formed, I mean, I'd be going back to kind of, maybe the start of it was kind of the 2015 Asian Cup when South Korea, I think, had a leg up on the likes of Japan and obviously the West Asian countries as well. We know what happened in the final, of course, but that was obviously one that I think really kind of did start a new generation. And again, I don't want to just pin it all on Song Heung-min because I feel like we've obviously seen a lot of good players come through, through the system as well. Hong Ki-chan with Wolves when he was obviously, I think at his best there. So, again, is there any worries at all that I think a lot of the predicament they've faced in the last qualification cycle where there was a lot of mediocre results against, Palestine and countries like this. Did a lot of that come down to on the pitch affairs, or was a lot of it more to do certainly with that mismanagement off the field?
I mean, it was both. I've talked about the mismanagement, but you can put it all on Son Heung-min. I'm sorry, the guy is a freak. Uh, he is somebody I think we won't see in terms of South Korean player quality probably for our lifetimes and maybe our kids. Moving to Germany at the age of like 14, 15, I think, dropping out of high school in South Korea to go and becoming a Premier League Golden Boot winner is something that I think any country would be proud of, but a country as small as South Korea is basically crazy. And there is actually a big concern, I think, with the depth that's coming up. Yes, we have players in Europe. You mentioned Hwang Hee-chan. There's also young kids like Yang Min-hyuk at Spurs right now, Bae Jin-ho at Stoke. The issue is that I just think that just because they go to Europe doesn't mean they're good players, I guess. And I'm not trying to criticize any of them because I hope they do well, but a lot of them go to Europe and it seems like they end up shuffling between random clubs, going on loan, and not being able to establish themselves as consistent starters every year at big clubs because maybe they're just not good enough. Look at a guy like Hwang Hee-chan, who I think has been an excellent servant for the national team. His stint at Wolves has been okay, but I think now he's definitely at a point where he has to leave because he's not part of the long-term plans there. He's always injured, and he's only like 28, 29. So I think there is also a lack of player quality. I think it's a weird thing where Korean football is producing lots of good talent who are good enough to play in Europe, but just because you're good enough to play in Europe doesn't mean that you're always going to produce results, if that makes sense. And that is a huge concern, I think, in the attacking positions, but also in defense, in the net, in the back line, just everywhere in general.
Just for context, you can say soccer to an Australian. Yeah, that's all good.
I'm trying to make better habits, but yeah, I appreciate it.
Don't worry, I go through the whole thing as well. But look, I think if there's a parallel I can make here, I think when our players go out to Europe from our league here in Australia,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
there's definitely a lot of players that make the move too soon and they get caught in the middle, right? So I think it's a very Asia specific problem that you're speaking to there. And it seems to me that the golden generation that's just gone, like it does seem to me that there's a bit of a problem really laden in trying to produce players of that caliber again. You just can't do it right. And I mean, I would know as an Australian because when I was kind of that impressionable age of kind of 8, 9, 10, that's when we had our golden generation. That's when Mark Viduka, Harry Kewell was going around, and the ability of trying to produce that talent again, it just couldn't happen for another 15, 20 years before now we look at the likes of Nestria and Kunda and things like that. So it is definitely a generational problem. But I was going to kind of touch on this a little bit later, but I might as well ask: is there anything that the K League could be doing different in terms of being able to really produce better quality Korean players that can help kind of maintain that kind of dominant kind of perception of being a giant of Asian football?
Yeah, I think the K League, while it's getting a lot better, and
Mm.
there's more diversity in the league too. Because back in the day, I think even the K League would restrict foreign goalkeepers in general from coming into the league. So there was also an issue of just diversity itself in the league. I think the bigger problem is just Korean coaches. I don't really rate many of them. I hate to say, maybe this is a little too big picture, but I think Korean society has a problem with hierarchy, with listening a little too much to authority, and just kind of sticking to old school values that wouldn't work in today's generation, if that makes sense. And there are some decent Korean coaches out there, don't get me wrong, but I think many of them come from that 2002 era of players who are now all in their 50s. And a lot of these people also do run companies in Korean society, and they're becoming top managers. And just the way they think is just so different from a lot of these young players. And I think there is a bit of a generational disconnect between even the players and the managers themselves. It leads to coaches being hired and fired at crazy paces in the K League, and it definitely makes it harder for Korean players, I think, to get better and improve. And I think also probably another big part of the problem, I think, is with the players themselves, not just on the managers, is that a lot of them are very comfortable living in South Korea. They're treated like gods and icons here, even if they're not on the level of Son Heung-min. If they're like the captain or hero of their local high school or club team, then they'll be treated as such. And I think that gets to their heads a little bit. And the fact is, many of them don't speak English as well as their maybe obviously their Aussie counterparts, their European counterparts, or whatever. So when they make the transition to Europe, let's say they can't really integrate as well with the culture. I think some of them, and a lot of them end up being pretty lonely. I remember last year I went to Germany, where I interviewed Lee Hyun-ju, who was playing at Hanover at the time on loan from Bayern, and I asked him about what he and his friends do in their free time, all the other young Korean players in Europe, and they're like, oh well, we just stay home and play games and talk to our friends in Korea. And I mean, I'll respect you whatever you want, but I think that shows kind of like you kind of have to be part of the culture when you go somewhere new, right, and make friends and just you kind of embrace it, which is what Sonny did when he went to Tottenham, I think, to be fair. And if you don't even have that in your head mentally, like this mentality where you gotta just embrace this new challenge and you're more comfortable just hanging out with people you're used to, I think that's also a big problem as well. And I think there's responsibility on both the players and the coaches.
There's a lot that you've just kind of revealed in there. I think the first question, I have two questions that are kind of twofold to that as a rebuttal. Firstly, if there's not enough domestically being done to produce, I think, managerial figures in an effective way, does the national team have to keep going forward with a lot of foreign influence from its coaches then? Because it seems to me as though there's next to no faith in the guy that's just been appointed. But I look at the Jurgen Klinsmann appointment as well, and I distinctly remember coming up against Australia coming up against South Korea in that quarterfinal, and there being a lot of conjecture and a lot of controversy around Klinsmann and the FA having issues with him. So I'm just curious what your input is on that.
Yeah, of course. I don't think things are binary. I don't want any foreign coach just because they're foreign. Doesn't mean that they're the right person for the job. But I do think in general that there is a lack of quality with Korean managers. So if I had to choose, I would probably lean towards the foreign manager. But if the foreign manager doesn't have much of a resume, if he's just the wrong, tactical fit, then of course I don't want him to take charge of the national team. So in that sense, no. I think that there are some decent Korean coaches who are a bit younger, plying their trade in some other more unknown leagues, for example. It's just that most of the names we know in terms of Korean managers, such as Hong Myung-bo, the current manager of the Korean national team, or maybe Shin Tae-yong, who used to manage Indonesia. I think that when you compare it relatively to other countries, even when you compare it to somewhere like Australia where you have an Ange Postecoglou, the quality just it ain't the same in my opinion.
Okay, I come back to this whole kind of modern generation of Korean guys. A lot of them, like you say, they really struggled to adapt with the culture and they have certain reputations about themselves and just certain ways that they conduct themselves. I do wonder though, something that a Japanese journalist said to me just gone in this recent window is, although Japan rocked up to Australia to play the Socceroos with a very kind of weaker squad, there was this mob mentality of an East Asian mentality is you almost have this kind of militarial kind of style where you're really patriotic and you really do stick by each other and you give it your all because that's just how the discipline works in East Asia. I mean, do any of those values transition over to not just the national team as a whole, but also youth tournaments and youth national teams as well. Who I really when looking across the board at South Korea, I don't know that there's ever been like a really good youth team that's done well at a World Cup or anything like that. So I mean, just does a lot of those values still kind of come through to talent that's being produced at all?
Yeah, for sure. I think some of those, traditional East Asian values that you mentioned can actually be a big plus. I think in comparison to maybe the European counterparts, you hear less stories about prominent Asian players going crazy and doing wild stuff in their times when they're in their professional careers, right? I think part of that is related to the discipline, the feeling of wanting to be part of a machine where you do your job properly, you keep your head down, you're modest, and I think there's a lot of value to that as well. I just think the issue is when it comes to moving abroad and integrating into a new club atmosphere is where problems can arise. With the national team more specifically, it's good, I think, in a lot of ways because there's a lot of hierarchy and order. And when you're with the national team, you're not always with them for weeks at a time like you are with the club. I think that's better because you can't really afford any discord. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think. And when it comes to Japan, I think, yeah, their cultures are very similar to ours. I think, well-mannered, modest, following the rules. But I also think another advantage that they have over us is that I think their youth development and the way their association is set up is just miles ahead of us. So
Yeah.
that also plays a part into it. And sorry, what was the second part of your question? I almost missed it.
Well, again, I was kind of just going with the at the youth ranks and things like that.
Oh yeah,
Does the discipline does it really pay
yeah, no,
off?
it does pay off. I don't really have any coaching experience, but I've interacted with some youth Korean players during my time living here, and I think a lot of them are definitely very focused and disciplined on what they want to get done, and they don't really give as much lip to the coaches who you're trying to teach them, to be fair. And in terms of results, Korea has recently had a good result at a Youth World Cup. We made it to the final of the U20 World Cup back in 2019. Actually, Lee Gang-in was the MVP of that team. They made it to the final and lost to Ukraine. So that was a historic moment for us and showed that we are capable of producing good talent. It's just a matter of doing that a bit more consistently, and I still think there are problems related to that.
Yeah. So I do actually want to touch on kind of a lot of my inspiration for actually having this chat with you, which was the national team's performance in Group B. Obviously we had Jordan coming off an Asian Cup final, but honestly, I think a lot of their performance flattered them in that tournament. You also had a very punchy Iraq team, and then Palestine and Kuwait, who I think performed better than people expected, but probably were still caught down, the kind of bottom rungs of that table, and Oman, who were basically stuck in the middle. I come again to I think with the character of a lot of those modern players as well, the fact that this was a group where you're exclusively going to West Asia of all places. Fair enough, it's probably been more convenient for a lot of those European-based players, which I think is a lot of something that a lot of East Asian teams kind of like, that the European players can come to a neutral location like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and play a game without having to go through all of that extensive travel. I'm kind of going off on a tangent there, sorry, but um, ultimately only 6 wins out of this group and a lot of really disappointing draws. I mentioned the Palestine match that was on neutral territory, a home loss to a home draw with Jordan in there as well. Was there very much a case of the South Korean team, I think, and I hope you can kind of agree with the sentiment here, because they were the top feeder in the group, they ultimately racked up a lot of points early on. It was a case of kind of settling and not really wanting to push another level once enough had been done to secure World Cup qualification.
So two things. One is that, yeah, a lot of the European players sometimes are able to fly directly to the Western Asia, but a lot of them actually do come to Korea first to meet with the team, and then they fly together. So the travel is pretty bad. But when it comes to the other question that you asked, I don't really think it was a matter of putting their foot off the gas. I just think they weren't able to do it because they weren't good enough, and also the tactics of the coach weren't good enough. Some of those games where they won, I think that 3-2 win over Iraq, if I'm not mistaken, was pretty good on paper. But when you look at the way that happened, it's Hong Myung-bo putting out the wrong starting 11, Iraq looking a lot more dangerous early on. I think they get a red card, and then Hong Myung-bo also gets a few injuries in his starting 11. He has to sub on some guys he didn't want to play. They play well. Korea goes on to win. So it's like almost kind of like a way where the South Korean team is just so much better than these other guys that, yeah, sure, they qualify, they racked up points early, but it's still very disturbing. I think the number of draws they racked up, they drew Palestine, they drew Kuwait, I believe, and there might be another team that they drew as well. But the main point is that these results should not have been as stagnant as they were. And of course, we call it qualified, so we can't complain too much. But when you look at the way Japan romped through their own qualifying group, which is, I think, a bit tougher than ours, it's not a good sign. And obviously, you can't always compare binary things like, oh, well, Japan did this, so we have to do that. But if, Korea is as prominent or prestigious as we believe we are in Asia, then I think we should have done a lot better in qualifying. And this is on the manager to a certain extent, but also I think on the players and maybe just the lack of quality that we have in certain positions.
Okay, well let's kind of open up on that. I mean, is there like a really big problem position? Firstly, not when I asked that, I'm not just asking about like the current starting 11 now. I'd also say structurally in terms of players that are being produced at that level. Because I mean, I know that for the last sort of 10 to 15 years, to use an Australian example, Aziz Behich, obviously legend of Australian, soccer, but he's obviously been someone that is, getting into his mid to late 30s, and they've had a few kind of A-League players come and go and step in his place, a few players that have bolted and made it into Europe. But ultimately, ever since, just shy of after the Brazil World Cup, we've basically had the exact same player stuck at the starting right back position, and it's just been such a problem. So is there anything like that going on with South Korea where there's actually just no one who can come and take that spot away from a senior player, or there's just no one that can be produced well enough at that level?
Yeah, I think like Australia, a lot of the specialist positions lack a lot of quality. Korea's fullbacks, I think I can't remember the last time we had two fullbacks that we could rely on defensively and offensively going forward. I think maybe part of that problem is because a lot of younger Korean players that have the ability to play at fullback or wingback would rather play as forwards because of what they saw growing up with Son Heung-min and Park Ji-sung. And I do think a lot of the times what ends up happening is we end up converting a lot of our wingers into fullbacks later on in their youth careers, and by that time, you're kind of what you are at that point. And if you can't really defend, which a lot of our fullbacks can't, that's a big problem. But also in the middle of the pitch, the number 6 position, the central defensive midfield position, has been a huge problem for South Korea. I think it's been well over a decade, if not more, since we've had number 6 that everyone could say, wow, that guy should start right away, and we don't really have to worry about what he brings onto the pitch. Just not developing one at all. There's a few guys who could be that guy maybe, but they haven't shown it on a consistent enough basis. The current starter, I've already crapped on him enough on my channel. Park Yong-woo, I think he's playing in somewhere in the Middle East right now. I think at the UAE. Just a terrible player in general. He can't pass, can't move, can't tackle, can't defend. Was basically given his starting job by Jurgen Klinsmann at the 2023 Asian Cup and has been used ever since as the number 6, which I think is insane. So, this, like I said, the central defensive midfield, the fullbacks, but also the striker position. The number 9, I know in world football this is a common problem, I think, because a lot of countries are just producing forwards or midfielders, but for South Korea, we really lack a proper number 9 who can not just hold up the ball, but also, kind of move in an intelligent way to link up with guys like Son Heung-min and Lee Gang-in. So yeah, I think the middle of the park and then the specialist position outside, like the fullbacks, are a big problem for us. And it's both. It's the lack of players coming up through the system and also just the lack of senior quality at that level.
Okay, I want to move on to some of those figureheads. Obviously, I mean, we have to talk about him. Song Heung-min, obviously, really just a career-defining, moment, winning the Europa League under Ange Postecoglou, of course, and now saying farewell to Tottenham. Obviously, I would guess as a SoCal guy, you're actually relatively enthused for his move to LAFC as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, how do you begin to surmise not only the cultural impact that he's made, but also his ability to actually just take that South Korean team from being decent in Asia to now being respected in world football?
Yeah, he's our version of Michael Jordan, Superman, Ronaldo, Messi, whatever you want to call it. Just an icon. You'll see him everywhere on the streets in Seoul, on billboards. Yeah, what he's done can't be understated. I know a lot of fans like to talk about Park Ji-sung, and I respect Park Ji-sung. I love him, but what he did was more, I think, as a trailblazer to set the way for guys into top leagues. Yeah, Son Heung-min's impact on and off the field cannot be understated, and yeah, I'm happy to see him in LA as a SoCal native, but I'm also sad that he's leaving Europe because I think it's going to be a long time until we see someone of his quality just doing what he did and making us proud as a small country. And yeah, I think that this will probably be his last World Cup for sure. I think most likely his plan is to retire after the 2027 Asian Cup. Realistically speaking, South Korea is not going to win the World Cup, so the one national team trophy that he can win now after winning with Tottenham is the Asian Cup. So I think that's kind of what he's had his eyes on for a long time. In terms of the LAFC move, he's going to be one of the best players in the league. He should put up massive goal numbers, and I'm glad that he can be in a place where the World Cup is coming to, and maybe he won't have to travel as much as he used to. But yeah, it's a bit of a kind of bittersweet feeling in terms of kind of where Sonny's career is going right now. Yeah.
Okay, I do just want to actually mention that the one career-defining moment for I think a lot of Australians in the conscious of sort of Song Heung-min. Obviously, there's like the English Premier League because of obviously the cultural ties to Britain. I mean, people do just wake up at all crazy hours to watch him, and there are a lot of Tottenham fans in this country long before Ange Postecoglou came along. But the 2015 Asian Cup final, I distinctly remember a lot of Japanese and Korean fans came to the east coast of Australia for that tournament. And the thing that really resonates with me is obviously the footage of Postecoglou coming up to him, and he's absolutely bawling his eyes out, crying, just knowing that it's a title that really could have got him on the front foot, and he was just making it at Spurs at that time. You think sort of the emergence of himself, Ericsson, Harry Kane, it all kind of propped up at that time, and when Spurs arrived for pre-season in Western Australia, my kind of native area down here, obviously everyone was here to kind of greet Ange and kind of talk to him about the honour of coaching in the Premier League, being the first Australian to do it. And Song Heung-min's also with him in the room, kind of listening along, and the chat went on for a good 15-20 minutes, and Son finally gets to the mic. And he goes, before anyone asks, obviously, there's a lot of emotion here with what happened in 2015, and everyone was just, really, really kind of upbeat with the fact that not only he would kind of remember that, but also have the kind of connection to think, yeah, I've known Ange all of this time, and that's a really emotional moment for me, but also, with the Australian fan base and the connection to that part of the world. I just thought it was a really, really special moment and really kind of touched on who he was as a character as well. So, and that was just a tiny glimpse that I obviously have ever got with him, and it's more than a lot of people in the independent space in Australia could say. So I just thought I'd touch on that because again, yeah, absolute icon of the game, and someone that I think Asian football. You talk about South Korea not being able to produce someone of that talent, and I mean, sure, Japan have I think consistently been very good in terms of their football development in the last 15 to 20 years, but I still don't know that they've had someone that good. I would say KSK Honda was there for a little while, but just the idea that any country in East Asia or even some of the good Arab players we've had in West Asia, no one is going to come that close.
He's the best Asian player of all time.
Yeah, yeah. And I really think that South Korea breaking that duck with the Asian Cup, it's been since 1960, which is quite hard to conceptualize as well. It doesn't make sense, really, but that's the nature of the beast. So I think 2027, yeah, I really would love to see that. Last thing before we go, I don't know if you would have many expertise on the kind of nuances of this at all, but obviously we do have the Women's Asian Cup arriving on Australian soil in March next
Yeah.
year. Firstly, just I know that obviously there is a lot of kind of systemic misogyny and things that have gone on where the game was taken back years, but in a lot of contexts, in a lot of certain countries, I think the game really is starting to modernize, and women's football is really professionalizing. Certainly in Europe, certainly it's always been that way in the US. Really, a country like Australia, we've obviously gotten on board, hosted the World Cup. For East Asia in particular, how can you kind of speak to the rise of women's football in a country like South Korea? Does it still have a long way to go? And how does the national team stack up? Do you think?
Yeah, man, I don't want to say I'm an expert on women's football because I'm not, but I do have something to say about this. Firstly, yes, there's a lot of internalized misogyny, and it'd be silly not to call it out. I think our women's team has some decent young players who are playing abroad. Like our best ever player, Chis Ho Yun, is played in England before, put up numbers there. So she is like one of our best players. And the national team, basically, there's stories of them getting forced to come back from trips and come to the airport and change in the airport bathrooms because they have to give their shirts and pants back to the KFA because the KFA doesn't want to allow them to have clothes, I guess. So you can see kind of what the women are up against. In terms of the Korean women's national team, getting better, getting better. Not the best team in Asia by any stretch of the imagination. Last time we made it to the knockout stages of a World Cup, I believe, was back in 2015, which was an amazing result. I think, again, not to go full too big picture here, but I think when you look at the best women's teams in the world, Spain, the USA, I would say Australia is pretty darn good as well, England, I think they have advanced to a point where their societies and cultures are a little, I don't know if it's controversial, but a little more willing and let women from all sexual gender or backgrounds and genders be comfortable. And I think in South Korea the problem is we could have a lot more better players, but just many South Korean girls are not inclined to play the sport at all because being athletic here is still viewed as something of a man's game, right? It's like, oh, you're a woman, you should do this and that. Although South Korea is getting better at a lot of that, I think from what I've seen, especially at schools, because I sometimes teach English to kids here as well as when I noticed that a lot of these girls just aren't encouraged to try new things that are not traditionally quote unquote female, and I think that is a big problem in terms of the player pool because there's just not a lot of women who play the sport here. And although it's getting bigger and bigger every year, I think this is a long-term problem that the society just has to address if we want our women's team to get better. I'm still proud of the work we've done. I think one of our last managers, Colin Bell, who's from the UK, didn't have a lot of good results with the national team, but he came in, he tried to learn the language, he tried to get accustomed to the culture, he tried to really form a bond with the players. So I think if we have more of those kind of people in charge, whether they're Korean or foreigners, I think it could lead to something better. But I also think this is something that the society in general needs to work on. And maybe I'm going too big picture, but I really think football is so important that it's really related to the society you live in, and it reflects that as well. And I think that South Korea has a long, long way to go when it comes to supporting just women's sports and women's empowerment in general. Yeah.
Well, if I were to kind of end this off with a final question for you, what is the expectation, or actually not even that, what is kind of a vibe that you're feeling right now with the current predicament the men's national team are in? How does the World Cup next year kind of shape up for them? Round of 32, round of 16, what are we looking at?
In an ideal world, I think we would want to make it to the quarterfinals just because that would be our best finish in a World Cup since besides the 2002 World Cup. But again, with the current manager, with the issues that we're having, I think my realistic expectation is we'll get knocked out in the round of 16. I think round of 32 knockout is a little too embarrassing, and I think given how many weak teams will be at this World Cup, that we should be able to reach past that stage. Anything past the round of 16, I will be very surprised at. I just do not rate this manager. I know we're short on time, but he is a player who was a legendary Asian player, just not a good manager in general, got the job because nobody else really wanted it or could do it. Doesn't really have a tactical strategy that can help you beat a bigger team or cause an upset in a round of 16 like match. So, yeah, I think the general sentiment here is one of pessimism, to be honest. Maybe the casual fans might be like, oh, well, why can't we make it farther than we did the last World Cup? But I think people who consistently follow the sport will tell you realistic expectation is get out of the group, maybe win the round of 32 match, and then get knocked out in the round of 16.
All right, Albert. Well, thanks so much for your time, and yeah, it's obviously it's been a pleasure, and thanks for giving the Korean view on all things football.
Appreciate it. Thank you.